What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors comes face to face with a host who refuses to show basic courtesy? You won't believe what unfolds when Denzel Washington sits down for what should have been a simple promotional appearance, only to find himself under attack from the very first question. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how not to treat your guests, and the explosive aftermath will leave you speechless. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when one of cinema's greatest talents reaches his breaking point on live television. Last night's episode of Good Morning America started like any other morning show segment. The familiar theme music played, the cameras rolled, and Robin Roberts sat across from Denzel Washington in the studio's plush interview chairs. But within minutes, what appeared to be a standard promotional appearance for Washington's latest directorial project would transform into one of the most uncomfortable confrontations in morning television history. The tension was palpable from the moment Washington settled into his seat. Roberts, known for her sometimes aggressive interviewing style, had clearly come prepared with an agenda that went far beyond discussing his new film. Her opening remarks carried an edge that immediately put the acclaimed actor on guard, though he maintained his characteristic composure as the cameras captured every micro-expression. "Denzel, good morning," Roberts began, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I have to say, there's been quite a bit of controversy surrounding some of your recent comments about the entertainment industry and social media. Some people are calling your views outdated, even hypocritical given your own career trajectory." Washington's eyebrows raised slightly, a subtle indication that he hadn't expected such an immediate confrontational tone. He leaned back in his chair, studying Roberts with the same intensity he brought to his most dramatic roles. "Good morning, Robin. I'm here to talk about my film, but I'm always happy to discuss my views if that's the direction you want to take this." The veteran actor's response was measured, professional, but there was an unmistakable shift in his demeanor. Those familiar with Washington's interviews knew that when he adopted that particular tone, calm but with an underlying steel, he was preparing for battle. Roberts, however, seemed oblivious to the warning signs, or perhaps chose to ignore them entirely. She pressed forward with what felt less like journalism and more like a personal attack. "But don't you think it's problematic when someone of your stature criticizes the very platforms and systems that have helped elevate voices that might not otherwise be heard? Some are saying you're out of touch with the reality of how young people communicate today." The studio atmosphere grew noticeably tense. Camera operators exchanged glances, and even the usually bustling background activity seemed to quiet as crew members sensed something significant was building. Washington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained controlled as he responded. "Robin, I think there might be some confusion about what I actually said versus what's been reported," Washington replied, his tone carrying just the slightest edge. "I've always been supportive of new voices and opportunities. What I've questioned is the replacement of genuine human connection and thoughtful discourse with the kind of instant, often uninformed reactions that social media can encourage." But Roberts wasn't backing down. If anything, she seemed energized by his response, leaning forward aggressively in her chair. "That sounds like someone who's comfortable with the old system trying to preserve it. Your generation had opportunities that you're now essentially telling younger people they shouldn't pursue in the same way." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Washington's composure, legendary throughout decades of interviews and press appearances, showed its first real crack. His hands, which had been casually resting on the chair arms, now gripped them slightly. When he spoke, there was a new quality to his voice, still controlled, but with an underlying current that suggested Roberts was venturing into dangerous territory. "My generation," Washington repeated, his voice dropping to a lower register that anyone who had seen his more intense film roles would recognize immediately. "Robin, I think you might want to be careful about making assumptions about what I believe or what I'm telling anyone to do. I've spent my entire career opening doors, not closing them." The exchange was rapidly moving beyond the bounds of typical morning show banter. Roberts, perhaps sensing she had struck a nerve, doubled down on her approach. But your recent statements about social media influence and instant fame, don't they essentially dismiss the experiences of an entire generation of content creators and influencers who have built legitimate careers? Washington's laugh was short and entirely humorless. Legitimate careers? Robin, are we really going to sit here and pretend that someone getting famous for dancing in their bedroom is the same thing as the craft that people like Sidney Poitier, Ruby Dee, and James Earl Jones dedicated their lives to perfecting? The comparison struck like lightning, and Roberts visibly bristled. So you're saying their work isn't real work? That they don't deserve respect or recognition? That's not what I said, and you know it, Washington shot back, his legendary patience finally beginning to fray at the edges. What I'm saying is that there's a difference between entertainment and artistry, between viral moments and lasting impact. But apparently, having standards and believing in the value of dedicated craft makes me the villain in your narrative. The studio had gone completely silent except for the hum of cameras and equipment. Even the teleprompter operators seemed frozen, unsure whether they should continue with the planned segment or prepare for something entirely different. Robert's producer could be seen in the background making frantic gestures, but whether they were signals to continue or to change course was unclear. Roberts, now fully committed to her confrontational approach, pressed harder. I think what viewers are hearing is someone who benefited from a certain system now criticizing people who are trying to create their own opportunities outside of that system. Isn't there some hypocrisy in that? The word hypocrisy landed like a physical blow. Washington's entire demeanor shifted, his shoulders squaring and his gaze becoming laser-focused on Roberts. When he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his decades of experience and his reputation for never backing down from a fight. Hypocrisy? Washington's voice was dangerously quiet now, the kind of calm that preceded a storm. Robin, I need you to explain to me exactly what you think you know about my journey, about the obstacles I've faced, about the doors that were slammed in my face, and about the work I've done to open those same doors for others. Because right now, it sounds like you're making accusations based on some talking points rather than actual knowledge. But just as the confrontation reached this crucial tipping point, just as Washington's legendary composure began to give way to something far more intense, Roberts made a decision that would push the entire interview past the point of no return. Instead of recognizing the dangerous territory she had entered, instead of acknowledging that she was facing one of the most respected actors of his generation, who was clearly reaching his limit, Roberts chose to escalate further. She pulled out what appeared to be prepared notes from beneath her desk, her movement deliberate and calculated in a way that suggested this had been planned from the beginning. Actually, Denzel, since we're talking about hypocrisy, Roberts said, her voice taking on a tone that was both smug and accusatory, I have some quotes here from various interviews you've given over the past few years. Let me read them to you and see if you can explain the contradictions. Washington's face went completely still. The transformation was startling. Gone was any pretense of the affable movie star doing a promotional interview. In its place sat a man who looked like he was calculating exactly how much damage he was willing to do on live television. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper but carried more menace than if he had shouted. You're going to read me my own words? On live television, like some kind of gotcha journalism exercise? Washington's eyes never left Robert's face. Robin, I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing right now, because once you cross this line, there's no going back to pretending this is a friendly morning show chat. The warning was crystal clear, delivered with the kind of authority that had made Washington one of Hollywood's most formidable presences both on and off screen. But Roberts, either driven by misplaced confidence or simply unable to read the room, ignored every signal and pressed forward with her ambush. Here's what you said in 2019 about method acting, Roberts began, reading from her notes with theatrical emphasis. You called it self-indulgent nonsense, and said actors who claimed they couldn't break character were hiding behind technique instead of doing the work. But then in 2022, you praised several method actors, and even said you understood the approach better after working with some younger performers. So, which is it? The question was delivered with the kind of confrontational energy typically reserved for politicians caught in scandals, not respected artists discussing their craft. Washington's response was swift and devastating in its precision. Robin, are you seriously suggesting that learning and evolving over the course of 3 years is somehow a character flaw? That gaining new perspectives through experience makes me a hypocrite? Washington's voice was rising now, not in volume but in intensity. Because if that's your standard, then I'd love to hear you explain every opinion you've changed since 2019. But Roberts wasn't finished. She flipped through her notes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had clearly spent considerable time preparing this attack. And what about this quote from last year where you said social media was destroying genuine discourse? But then your own production company has used social media extensively to promote your projects. Isn't that using the very system you're criticizing? The studio had become a pressure cooker. Camera operators were capturing every moment of what was quickly becoming one of the most uncomfortable interviews in morning television history. Production assistants in the background looked frozen, unsure whether they should intervene or let the confrontation play out. Even the teleprompter had been abandoned as it became clear this interview had gone completely off script. Washington stood up abruptly from his chair, the sudden movement causing everyone in the studio to tense. But instead of storming off, he walked around to face Roberts more directly, his movement deliberate and controlled, in a way that somehow made it more intimidating than if he had been obviously angry. "Let me help you understand something, Robin," Washington said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his decades in the entertainment industry. Using a tool and believing that tool is being used responsibly are not mutually exclusive concepts. My production company uses social media because we live in the real world, not because I think the current state of online discourse is healthy or productive. Roberts, perhaps realizing she had pushed too far but unable to back down without losing face, doubled down once again. "But don't you see how that sounds to people who are genuinely trying to build careers and create content? It sounds like you're saying the rules are different for established stars like yourself." The accusation of elitism was the final straw. Washington's composure, legendary throughout his career for remaining intact under the most intense pressure, finally cracked completely. When he spoke, his voice carried a cold fury that made everyone in the studio take an involuntary step back. "Different rules?" Washington's laugh was harsh and entirely without humor. "Robin, let me tell you about different rules. Different rules is when I had to be twice as good as everyone else just to get half the opportunities. Different rules is when I had to fight for roles that should have been offered without question. Different rules is when people questioned whether a black actor could carry a major film, or whether audiences would accept me in certain types of roles." The personal nature of Washington's response caught Roberts off guard, but she pressed forward with what appeared to be growing desperation. "But that's exactly my point. You overcame those obstacles. You succeeded despite those challenges. So why are you now criticizing people who are trying to overcome their own obstacles in different ways?" Washington's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Because there's a difference between overcoming obstacles through dedication, craft, and perseverance, and expecting success to come from viral moments and instant gratification. There's a difference between earning respect and demanding it. The confrontation had moved far beyond typical interview territory into something that felt deeply personal for both participants. Roberts, her carefully prepared ambush having backfired spectacularly, seemed to be improvising now, her questions becoming more scattered and desperate. "So you're saying that young creators today aren't dedicated? That they don't work hard? That their achievements aren't legitimate?" Roberts' voice was rising, matching Washington's intensity, but without his controlled power behind it. Washington moved closer to Roberts' desk, his presence now completely dominating the studio space. "I'm saying that dedication means more than posting content and waiting for likes. I'm saying that craft means more than whatever happens to go viral this week. And I'm saying that someone with your platform should understand the difference instead of trying to create controversy where none exists." The accusation that Roberts was manufacturing drama for ratings hit its target perfectly. Her face flushed, and for the first time in the interview, she seemed genuinely rattled rather than merely confrontational. "I'm not creating controversy. I'm asking legitimate questions about statements you've made publicly," Roberts shot back. But her voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier in the interview. Washington's response was swift and cutting. "No, Robin, what you're doing is taking quotes out of context, manufacturing contradictions that don't exist, and ambushing a guest who came here in good faith to discuss his work. This isn't journalism, it's a hit job." The studio fell into complete silence except for the hum of equipment and the barely audible whispers of crew members. Roberts looked around as if seeking support from her producers, but the expressions on everyone's faces made it clear that this confrontation had gone far beyond anything they had anticipated or prepared for. But Washington wasn't finished. His years of experience dealing with difficult interviews, hostile critics, and industry politics had prepared him for this moment, and he was about to deliver a response that would change everything. Washington straightened to his full height, his presence now completely commanding the studio. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had earned every accolade, every award, and every ounce of respect through decades of unwavering professionalism and dedication to his craft. "Robin, I want you to look at me," Washington said, his voice cutting through the studio silence like a blade. "Really, look at me. I am a 2-time Academy Award winner. I have been nominated 9 times. I have received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I have been honored by the Kennedy Center, the American Film Institute, and countless other institutions that recognize excellence in the arts." Roberts shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly unprepared for the full force of Washington's accumulated authority being directed at her so personally and directly. But Washington wasn't done establishing his credentials. "I have directed films, produced projects that have launched careers, and mentored dozens of young actors who are now stars in their own right. I have used my platform to support education, veterans, and underserved communities for over 3 decades, and you're sitting here trying to lecture me about hypocrisy and being out of touch?" The rhetorical question hung in the air like a challenge that everyone in the studio knew Roberts couldn't possibly answer adequately. Washington moved even closer to her desk, his controlled intensity making everyone in the room acutely aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Let me tell you what hypocrisy actually looks like, Robin," Washington continued, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge. "Hypocrisy is inviting someone onto your show under the pretense of discussing their work, then ambushing them with a coordinated attack designed to generate controversy and ratings. Hypocrisy is claiming to support honest journalism while engaging in the kind of tabloid tactics that destroy careers and reputations." Roberts attempted to interject, but Washington raised his hand in a gesture that was both polite and absolutely commanding. "I'm not finished." The studio fell into complete silence again. Even the background crew had stopped their usual bustling activity, transfixed by the confrontation unfolding before them. Washington's next words would become the moment that defined the entire interview. "You want to talk about being out of touch? Let's talk about a host who thinks ambushing respected guests is good television. Let's talk about someone who confuses controversy with journalism, who mistakes aggression for insight. You've spent the last 15 minutes trying to tear down someone who has spent 40 years building up not just his own career, but an entire industry's respect for the craft of acting." Robert's face had gone pale, but she made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "Denzel, I think you're overreacting. These are legitimate questions that viewers want answered." Washington's laugh was sharp and entirely humorless. "Overreacting? Robin, the only thing I'm reacting to is disrespect masquerading as journalism. And if you think your viewers tuned in this morning, hoping to see you try to embarrass a guest who came here in good faith, then you understand your audience even less than you understand your role as a host." The veteran actor began moving toward his chair, but not to sit down, to retrieve the small clip-on microphone that would allow him to make his exit. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable to everyone watching. "Here's what I think happened. Washington continued as he unclipped his microphone with practiced efficiency. "I think someone on your team decided that taking down Denzel Washington would make for good television. I think you bought into the idea that controversy equals content, that creating conflict equals creating compelling viewing." Roberts made a desperate attempt to salvage the interview. "Denzel, please, let's continue this conversation. I think there's been a misunderstanding about my intentions." Washington paused in his movement toward the studio exit, turning back to face Roberts one final time. His expression was one of complete disappointment rather than anger, which somehow made his words even more devastating. "There's no misunderstanding, Robin. Your intentions were perfectly clear from your very first question. You came prepared for an ambush, and you executed it exactly as planned. The only thing you didn't plan for was how it would feel when your guest refused to play along with your script." The condemnation was complete and final. Washington's tone had shifted from heated confrontation to something far more damaging: professional disappointment delivered with the authority of someone whose opinion actually mattered in the industry. "I've been doing interviews for 4 decades, Robin. I've sat across from journalists who challenged me, who asked tough questions, who held me accountable for my words and actions. But they did it with respect, with context, and with the understanding that their job was to inform viewers, not to create spectacle." Roberts looked around the studio as if seeking help from her production team, but the expressions on everyone's faces made it clear that this disaster was entirely her own creation. Washington, meanwhile, had reached the point where his patience was not just exhausted but completely transformed into something else entirely. "You know what the real tragedy is here?" Washington asked, his voice now carrying a note of genuine sadness. "I came here excited to talk about a project I'm passionate about, a film that tackles important themes and showcases incredible performances from a diverse cast. Instead, we've spent 20 minutes with you trying to manufacture controversy out of nothing." Washington shook his head, the gesture carrying decades of experience with media manipulation and professional disappointment. "This is exactly what's wrong with media today. The focus isn't on elevating important work or meaningful conversation. It's on creating conflict, generating clicks, and turning every interaction into a battleground." The studio had become a tomb of silence, broken only by the sound of Washington's footsteps as he moved deliberately toward the exit. But he wasn't finished delivering his final assessment of what had just occurred. "I hope your viewers understand what they just witnessed," Washington said, turning back toward the cameras for the first time since the confrontation had escalated. "They didn't see journalism. They didn't see accountability. They saw someone more interested in creating drama than fostering genuine dialogue." Roberts made one last desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of professional control. "Denzel, I hope you'll consider coming back when we can have a more productive conversation." Washington's response was swift, final, and delivered with the kind of authority that ended discussions rather than continuing them. "Robin, there won't be a next time. I don't do business with people who operate in bad faith, and what happened here today was about as bad faith as it gets." With that declaration, Washington removed his microphone completely and handed it to a nearby audio technician with a polite nod that demonstrated his respect for the crew even in the midst of his complete disdain for the host's behavior. "To your viewers," Washington said, addressing the cameras directly one final time, "I apologize that you didn't get to hear about the incredible work being done by the cast and crew of our new film. Maybe you can catch one of our other interviews where the focus will actually be on the art instead of manufactured controversy." The dismissal was complete and devastating. Without another word to Roberts, without any acknowledgement of her attempts to salvage the situation, Washington walked off the set with the same dignity and presence he had brought to every role, every interview, and every public appearance throughout his legendary career. The cameras continued rolling for several more seconds, capturing Roberts sitting alone at her desk, her prepared notes scattered uselessly in front of her. The studio filled with the kind of stunned silence that follows when someone has been thoroughly and publicly outclassed by a master of their craft. And with that, one of the most explosive confrontations in morning television history came to its dramatic conclusion. leaving viewers with an unforgettable example of what happens when professional ambush tactics meet uncompromising dignity and 40 years of earned authority in the entertainment industry.